The 2nd of March, 1974, the jungle breathes with a strange, almost sentient patience, as if it has waited nearly 3 decades for this very moment. The leaves quiver under a faint breeze that does not belong to any season, and in the thick shadows of Lubang Island in the Philippines, a man steps forward with the suspicion of a hunted animal. His uniform is in tatters, his rifle maintained with monastic devotion, and his face weathered, hollow, yet burning with unwavering purpose carries the weight of a war he believes never ended. His name is Hiroo Onoda, an Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officer who has remained hidden since 1945, surviving in absolute loyalty to an empire that no longer exists. It is on this day, after 29 years of silence, ambush, coded notebooks, and whispered military rituals performed in the dark, that he will finally learn a truth the world accepted long ago. The war is over. The story of how Onoda reached this moment is not merely the account of one soldier's refusal to surrender. It is a window into the most obscure layers of World War II, the hidden machinery of espionage and psychological warfare that shaped soldiers like him and ensured that some never returned, mentally or physically, from the shadows they were trained to disappear into. His long vigil in the jungle is inseparable from the classified operations of the Japanese military intelligence apparatus, the secret directives that taught certain officers to vanish, to endure without command, and to resist information that might break the imperial spell. Onoda was not an accident of history. He was a product of systems designed for total war, constructed in the years when Japan's high command believed they were fighting not just armies but entire civilizations, and therefore needed men capable of dissolving into the terrain like ghosts. When the war began, few outside the uppermost circles of Japan's intelligence bureaus knew that a network of self-sustaining operatives had been quietly formed, men selected not for brute strength, but for psychological endurance. They were trained to resist what the Imperial General Staff believed would be America's attempt to wage a war of deception, propaganda, and mental erosion. Onoda's training in the Futamata branch of the Nakano School was filled with lessons not spoken of publicly. How to read the jungle not as scenery but as a system of signals. How to store information without writing it down. How to dismantle enemy morale through rumor and subtle sabotage. And most importantly, how to distrust every message that did not come from a superior officer in person. Surrender leaflets, encoded broadcasts, civilian voices, these were to be treated as weapons of the mind. The instructors emphasized again and again that psychological warfare would likely outlast gunfire. If ordered, some were expected to operate for years without contact. Onoda absorbed these doctrines with the zeal of a true believer. Lubang Island was never meant to be a simple defensive post. Unbeknownst to most Japanese soldiers stationed there, its strategic importance came not from its size but from its position as a potential intelligence relay point. Internal military documents later declassified indicated plans to use small Philippine islands as fallback locations for coded transmissions should the main communication hubs fall. These islands were to host hidden storage lockers of encrypted reports, long-range radio batteries, and supply caches for operatives trained to stay behind enemy lines indefinitely. When Onoda landed in December 1944, his mission was framed not merely as resisting the inevitable American invasion, but as maintaining surveillance on troop movements, monitoring the coastline, and preserving the possibility of future intelligence operations. In essence, he was to be a living sensor embedded into the landscape, one node in a secret network that imagined itself, lasting long after the Empire's territories were lost. The typical narrative tells us that Japan's defeat in 1945 was abrupt, a clean break enforced by the atomic bombs and the Emperor's surrender broadcast. But the truth beneath that surface is darker. Many sectors of the military refused to accept the reality of defeat at first, and a web of conflicting communications emerged. Some intelligence officers believed the broadcast was a psychological trick by Allied forces designed to lure remaining soldiers into revealing themselves. Others feared internal coups or rogue factions attempting to seize control. In this confusion, orders to surrender did not reach every corner of the Pacific cleanly. Some messages were delayed, some distorted by damaged radio equipment, and some, particularly those transmitted toward isolated islands, were lost entirely. Onoda, deep in the undergrowth and guided by the doctrines instilled into him, was mentally prepared for deception. When leaflets rained down from American plains, he saw not mercy but manipulation. When local villagers approached with warnings, he interpreted it as enemy strategy. For him, the very existence of surrender announcements confirmed that the psychological war he had been trained to resist was underway. As months stretched into years, the world around him transformed in ways he could not imagine. Japan rebuilt itself, the empire dissolved, cities rose from ashes, and global power structures shifted. Yet Onoda remained in a time capsule sealed by the jungle and his unbreakable loyalty. He observed from the shadows, convinced that every local Filipino farmer could be an American collaborator and every rumor of peace a carefully engineered lie. When his small group dwindled first through separation, later through death, he interpreted the losses as casualties in a still active resistance effort. Each engagement with locals, each skirmish, each ambush he conducted became another chapter in a private war sustained by habit, ideology, and the weight of an oath he felt bound to fulfill even in solitude. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies worldwide entered the Cold War era. Dissecting the psychology of soldiers like Onoda, his name appeared sporadically in reports as rumors, circulated about Japanese holdouts still fighting in the wild. By the 1950s, Western analysts were studying the concept of lost warriors as examples of psychological conditioning powerful enough to resist reality. Some believed holdouts were driven by insanity. Others correctly suspected a deeper, more engineered mindset, a product of wartime indoctrination, strategies that modern militaries found both impressive and disturbing. Unbeknownst to Onoda, his ghost-like existence was being discussed in rooms thousands of miles away, influencing theories on long-term psychological resilience and methods of controlling individual belief even under extreme conditions. In Japan, Onoda's family lived through years of uncertainty. They were informed he was missing, presumed dead. Yet fragments of testimonies from Filipino locals reached Japanese officials, suggesting sightings of armed men in the mountains. Over time, enough rumors accumulated that the Japanese government sent search parties between 1946 and 1950, but each attempt was undermined by the very training that shaped Onoda's worldview. He avoided open areas, studied patrol patterns, and treated rescue operations as enemy hunts. Even when a personal letter from his brother was broadcast through a loudspeaker, Onoda assumed the enemy had copied the handwriting. Every plea for peace, every offer of safety, only strengthened his belief that a psychological trap was being set for him. What few civilians realized was that Lubang Island, though small, had its own intricate wartime history. During the last years of the war, both Japanese and American forces used the region as a testing ground for covert tactics. Declassified American records reveal that several OSS teams experimented with misinformation drops in the Philippines, attempting to provoke Japanese units into revealing themselves by spreading contradictory news. Japanese intelligence knew this, training their operatives to expect such ploys. This background made it nearly impossible for Onoda to trust anything he saw or heard. Every sign of peace became, in his mind, another layer of the enemy's illusion. As decades passed, Onoda maintained meticulous discipline. He repaired his rifle, rationed ammunition, polished his sword with jungle oils, and kept hidden logbooks of observations on coastline activity. He believed he was contributing to a greater intelligence effort. There were nights he imagined coded transmissions still being relayed somewhere across the Pacific. Nights he stayed awake under monsoon rains waiting for a signal flare that would never come. When he encountered traces of modern technology plastic products, new fabrics, unfamiliar packaging, he concluded these were adaptations of American industry for wartime logistics. To him, the world's progress became evidence of the enemy's evolving capabilities. The psychological burden of such isolation cannot be understood simply as stubbornness. Onoda's mind, shaped by an empire that trained soldiers to choose death over surrender, was enclosed within layers of duty, fear, pride, and indoctrination. Accepting the war's end would mean admitting that decades of struggle, hunger, danger, and loss had been for nothing. The human mind protects itself from such annihilating realizations, and Onoda's resistance became less about ideology and more about preserving the meaning of his own existence. The jungle became not just his battleground, but his identity, a place where his mission still mattered. During the 1960s, stories about a mysterious Japanese soldier still fighting in the Philippines began circulating internationally. They blended with other accounts of Pacific holdouts discovered on remote islands. Each discovery, however, only deepened the mystery around Liu Bang's elusive ghost. When a few of Onoda's former comrades were tracked down and brought back to Japan, the government hoped their testimonies would convince any remaining soldiers to emerge. But the jungle swallowed all sound before it could reach him. By then, he was the last survivor of his original group. The others had fallen in skirmishes or succumbed to illness. Yet Onoda took their deaths as proof that the resistance was still active, that danger lurked everywhere, and that retreat was impossible. The deaths reinforced the narrative that surrender equaled betrayal. Even more obscure is the fact that by the late 1960s, some foreign intelligence agencies were curious whether holdouts like Onoda could be sources of information. The Cold War had intensified, and analysts wondered whether soldiers who had lived in isolation for decades might have unique psychological profiles useful for research. Some speculated that if captured alive, men like Onoda could be studied for insights into human endurance under prolonged ideological conditioning. Though no official orders were given to capture him, the whispers of his existence circulated in places far removed from the humid thickets of LUBANG. In 1972, the world changed again for Onoda, though he could not comprehend it. One of the last known holdouts in the region, Shoichi Shimada, who had long survived with him, was killed by local Philippine forces during an encounter. Onoda interpreted the death not as a consequence of misunderstanding, but as proof that infiltration had intensified. Shimada's loss isolated him completely. The jungle fell even quieter. Birds moved differently. The patterns of village life shifted, though he misread these changes as tactical adaptations by enemy forces. His mind, already shaped by decades of vigilance, sharpened into an unbreakable point of suspicion. Then came 1974, the year the world finally stepped into the isolated fortress of Onoda's reality. A young Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki ventured onto Lubang Island with the improbable goal of finding three things: a panda, a yeti, and Hiroo Onoda. Against all odds, he found the third. When Suzuki approached Onoda in the jungle and claimed the war was over, Onoda responded with the same unwavering resolve he had upheld for 29 years. He would not surrender until he received orders from his commanding officer. And so Suzuki returned to Japan, triggering a chain of events that would dig into the archives of a vanished empire. To locate Onoda's former superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the Japanese government had to sift through forgotten military records, many of which had been partially burned or deliberately erased in the chaotic days after the surrender. Taniguchi, who had long retired and was living quietly, was stunned to learn that one of his men was still faithfully carrying out an order issued decades earlier. He agreed to return to Lubang, and on the 2nd of March 1974, he walked into the jungle where a man still stood guard over a war that had ended before many of the island's children were born.